Welcome everybody from frigid Ottawa. It's like minus 25 this morning here. But at least we're better off than apparently Louisiana and Florida. I'm teasing, of course. I'm the country representative for ICA here based in Ottawa, Jean-Charles Lavallée, and I'm joined with my colleagues here. We're hosting the Zoom space. We've got interpreters in Costa Rica in Spanish. For those of you who are less familiar with Zoom, you can go to the bottom right and select Spanish or English and stick to that language for the rest of the webinar. If you don't see the globe, go to more, it'll appear there. So in terms of housekeeping, that's pretty much it. It's quite simple. We are delighted to partner once again with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and we're joined today with our main partner within CFIA, Marie-Pierre Mignot, and she's the national manager at the International Affairs Branch, CFIA. She'll be introducing her different colleagues. In terms of agenda, there's about 50 minutes of presentations, and then we'll do some Q&A. We're happy to monitor the chat. Sometimes we can allow some of the participants to speak directly, and we'll figure all that out in about an hour. We had over 100 people register. We're excited to have you. It's a great topic on plant-based meat and dairy alternatives in Canada, at least. I think if it's not last year, the year before, it was over a couple $2 billion worth of exports. We also import for Canada. The largest export market is the U.S., some Europe, some South Asia. South Korea and Japan. And in terms of protein, soy, vegetable proteins, gluten is a big one. Is quite small, vegetable proteins even smaller, but it's a growing market. There's demand in the US. It's about 25% of the population that are looking for meat substitutes. Really interesting topic. So we're delighted to have CFIA join us today to speak to these issues, and I'll pass it over to Marie-Pierre. And just before I pass it over, a reminder at the end, there will be 2 quick surveys, one by CFIA in the chat, one in Zoom with ICA, and we'd love your feedback on this webinar today. Over to you, Marie-Pierre.
Mil gracias, Jean-Charles, por estas lindas palabras de introducción. Entonces, muy buenas tardes a
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. This is the first event of CFIA. My name is Marie-Pierre Mignot. I am at CFIA. We are in charge of activities that are related to CFIA and animal health and food safety. In today's webinar, we will talk about the context and oversight and an industry landscape, the regulatory oversight and industry landscape in Canada, the product definitions and descriptions, what CFIA is doing regarding control measures. We have 3 different speakers, presenters from the food safety area, Michael O'Neill, Andrea Palmieri, and Gloria Mailer. I am very grateful for the collaboration between the ICA and CFIA. I hope that the information we will share is of use for you, and we will have time for questions at the end. So do not hesitate and ask any question. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the 3 speakers, Michael, Andrea, and Gloria.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I'll kick things off. Next slide, please. And one more, please. Okay, so thanks again for inviting us today. It's a great opportunity to speak about this topic. So just a little bit of background first. We decided to split plant-based foods into 2 categories, mainly due to their inherent differences. So we split them into plant-based alternatives to meat and plant-based alternatives to dairy. These are foods of plant origin that may be consumed in place of their traditional animal-based counterparts. The growth of this market has been extensive over recent years as consumers have shifted to seek out alternative protein sources. It is no longer only vegan or vegetarian consumers who are looking to buy these products. Other factors are driving demand, such as the awareness of the versatility of plant-based protein sources. So more and more people are learning how to cook with them and incorporate them into their recipes. We have a growing population seeking protein in their diets, which has created opportunities for other protein sources to step in and fill those demands. And many consumers are looking to reduce their consumption of meat and dairy products due for a number of other reasons, one being consumer awareness of environmental impacts caused by animal agriculture. Next slide, please. Okay, so to explain Canada's oversight of these products, I'd like to first briefly talk about Canada's regulatory structure and touch on the distinct roles and responsibilities. So in Canada, we have two federal regulatory bodies working together. Health Canada is responsible for setting regulatory standards and establishing policies governing the safety and nutritional quality of all food sold in Canada. You can think of them as a standard-setting body. This would include labeling requirements about the nutrients in food, the nutrition facts table, claims about those nutrients, the presence or declaration of food allergens, and safety-related expiration dates. For example, those that would be found on items such as infant formula. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency, you can think of us more as the enforcement body. We provide all federal inspection services related to food safety and consumer protection and enforce the food-related provisions of the Food and Drugs Act and regulations, in addition to the Safe Food for Canadians Act and regulations. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency also establishes the non-health and safety food labeling regulations related to misrepresentation, labeling, advertising, and standards of identity under the Food and Drugs Act and regulations. For food labels, this would include the company contact information, ingredient labeling, and quality-related best before dates, such as a best before date on a plant-based cheese, for example. Canadian Food Inspection Agency also establishes and administers regulations under the Safe Food for Canadians Act and regulations, which are a relatively new set of laws which came into force in 2019. This consolidated several existing commodity-specific regulations and legislation into one act and set of regulations that applies to all foods. The Safe Food for Canadians Act established a new requirement that all importers of food require a license and must have appropriate controls in place to mitigate risks of the products they import. Next slide, please. Okay, so now to give you an idea of the Canadian context when it comes to our food supply. So as previously mentioned, we are a large importer of food, one of the largest in the world, in fact. Our food imports have increased over recent years as consumers want foods from all over the world and at various seasons. In 2019, Canada imported $52 billion worth of agri-food and seafood products. This data may be a few years old, but still shows the magnitude of our import sector. Canadian importers source products from over 100 countries, which also means there is a wide variation in the level of food safety controls, oversight, and standards in comparison to Canada. Next slide, please. So when it comes to imports of plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy specifically, we import the vast majority from our largest trading partner and close neighbor to the south, the United States. The most frequently imported plant-based alternative to meat is plant-based burgers and patties. On the plant-based alternative to dairy side, the most frequently imported products are beverages, dairy-free creamers, and plant-based cheeses. Next slide, please. On the domestic side, Canada is home to some of the leading plant-based food manufacturers, such as Maple Leaf Foods, McCain Foods, and others listed here. Many traditional meat or dairy companies are expanding their product offerings to include plant-based alternatives. French-based company Roquette has opened the world's largest pea protein operation in Canada, in the province of Manitoba, to supply pea protein to companies that produce plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy. An industry association known as Plant-Based Foods of Canada was formed in 2018 and now lists 36 members and affiliates on their website. Their goal is to raise awareness of issues impacting the market for these products and to be a voice for the industry. They also offer a certification program which permits the use of a plant-based logo, which may be displayed on packaging and marketing materials. This logo helps consumers identify plant-based products. Next slide, please. So some of the trends that we are seeing around plant-based foods. In 2019, Canada updated our food guide, which is a document produced by Health Canada that provides guidelines for healthy eating. The latest version reflects the trend of including more plant-based foods in our diet. Recent surveys have shown that 40% of Canadians are actively trying to incorporate more plant-based foods in their diets. A 2023-24 Canadian study, which looked at consumption of foods during a 7-day period, revealed that plant-based beverages were consumed by 21.8% of Canadians. Other non-dairy products and substitutes were consumed by 16.3% of Canadians. And finally, plant-based alternatives to meat were consumed by 18.1% of Canadians. Recent data between 2015 and 2022 showed retail sales of plant-based alternatives to meat in Canada jumped from $150 to $284 million per year, which reflects the increased demand for these products. The retail sales of plant-based beverages or milk alternatives is forecasted to rise as well. Clearly, this is a segment of the market which has grown over recent years with additional growth forecasted. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to turn the presentation over now to my colleague, Andrea.
So product definitions. So regulatory-wise, the FDR and the SFCR currently do not provide a formal definition of plant-based foods. This is because the interpretation of what plant-based is can vary amongst the general public. For example, there's some plant-based food that could be described as vegetarian, which may contain some animal byproducts like milk or eggs. Or it can be described as vegan, a product completely absent of any animal-derived products. Ultimately, consumers would expect a plant-based food to be usable in place of an animal-derived product. There are industry associations that have their own definition and criteria when certifying products as plant-based. For example, the Plant-Based Foods of Canada Industry Association defines plant-based as alternatives to animal products, meat and seafood alternatives, ingredient alternatives, egg substitutes, and dairy alternatives. Single ingredient plant foods like vegetables and nuts are excluded. So for them, products with any amount of animal-derived ingredients are not eligible to be certified plant-based. But in general, plant-based foods include foods derived from whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, vegetables, fruits, and even fungi and algae. Next slide, please. All right, simulated meat and poultry products. So now we'll just go over the different types of plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy on the marketplace today. So CFIA differentiates between two types of plant-based alternatives to meat. The first category is called simulated meat and poultry products. These are defined in the Food and Drug Regulations. They are unstandardized foods that do not contain any meat, poultry, or fish products, and that have the appearance of a meat or poultry product. These products are purposely formulated to resemble a meat or poultry product, for example, by adding components to simulate bleeding or to simulate a marbling of fat effect of a burger. These foods are made mostly of plant-based ingredients like cereals, legumes, nuts, but sometimes may contain other animal-derived ingredients such as milk and eggs. These products must meet specific compositional and nutrition standards related to protein content, fat content, vitamins and minerals, since they must be nutritionally equivalent to animal-based meat and poultry products. And since simulated meat and poultry products are meant to substitute for a meat or poultry product, they can also be found in similar formats to animal products like burger patties and ground and sausages and deli meat style nuggets and so forth. Next slide, please. So CFIA recognizes a second category of plant-based alternatives to meat that are similar to, but do not meet the definition of simulated meat and poultry products. These are also unstandardized foods that do not contain any meat, any poultry or fish, and also do not have the appearance of meat or poultry product. So while these foods may have some visual characteristics that are similar to meat or poultry products, they are likely not to be mistaken for them. For example, these are your black bean burgers, tofu burgers, veggie balls, where they are clearly made from non-meat ingredients. Unlike simulated meat and poultry products, there are no standards for composition or nutrient requirements. Fortification is actually prohibited as they are not meant to provide the same nutrient profile as meat and poultry, since they're not considered substitutes for them. They should not be labeled and advertised with words or images that present or imply that they resemble or that they are comparable to meat and poultry products. Next slide, please. So plant-based alternatives to dairy. There are a few types of products that make up the plant-based alternatives to dairy category. These are unstandardized foods that are not defined in the FDR or SFCR. However, they must still comply with all food safety and labeling requirements as a manufactured food. So the first type is a plant-based alternative to milk or plant-based beverages. These are made from water extracts of nuts, seeds, grains, and legumes, and are homogenized to result in a fluid similar in appearance and consistency to cow's milk. There are plant-based alternatives to cheese, which are made from starches and plant protein powders of soy, pea, or nuts, which may also be fermented using lactic acid bacteria or yeasts. And then there are plant-based frozen desserts, like coconut-based ice cream, and other alternatives to dairy like soy-based sour cream, almond yogurt, and coffee creamers. Next slide, please. So now that we've gone through what types of products fall under plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy, we'll go through some of the hazards that have been identified in scientific literature and our own internal data. In general, plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy are highly processed products composed of many different ingredients. The raw agricultural ingredients used to make them can carry a variety of microbes and allergenic materials. Extraneous material like wood or metal can also be introduced at harvest or from the equipment during processing. The main food safety hazard associated with plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy is undeclared allergens, which is typical for manufactured foods. Like plant-based alternatives, many plant-based alternatives are made in the same establishments as animal-based foods, like in dairy facilities or meat processing plants as well. For example, the majority of recalls in Canada for undeclared allergens in plant-based dairy are for undeclared milk. Some recalls were the result of inaccurate ingredient declaration, such as sodium caseinate, which we will touch on specifically later. And so the multiple ingredients and processing steps without strong allergen controls along the chain increases the likelihood of cross-contamination. There are also microbiological concerns for plant-based alternatives. The final products tend to have a high moisture content and a neutral pH. And along with certain processing steps, such as soaking, it can make them vulnerable to microbiological growth. Unfortunately, plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy have been associated with recalls and foodborne illness outbreaks. There have been issues with contamination with spore-forming bacteria in both plant-based meat and dairy, Listeria species in plant-based beverages, and Salmonella species in nut-based cheeses. At the industry level, the extrusion process for plant-based meat and the pasteurization of plant-based alternative dairy beverages can help reduce the microbial load by applying a high temperature and pressure while processing the products. And there are other control measures that can be applied to reduce these microbial risks, such as consumers following safe cooking temperatures for plant-based meat. Although there has not been any updated guidance for cooking plant-based alternatives to meat, scientific literature has suggested treating them similarly to animal-based meat. Next slide, please. CFIA also has several risk control measures that can be put into place to prevent risk events from occurring. One important control measure at the agency is our targeted surveys under our surveillance program. Imported and domestic products are sampled and tested for microbiological, chemical, nutritional, and compositional hazards. These surveys provide evidence regarding the safety of the Canadian food supply, identify potential emerging hazards, and contribute to new information and data to food commodities where it may be limited or even non-existent. Surveys can also help identify trends and provide information about how well industry is complying with Canadian regulations. You can find all of the past food safety testing reports on our website under our Food Safety for Industry page. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you will see a snapshot of past targeted survey results for plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy. From 2020 to 2023, there were 2 targeted surveys conducted which analyzed over 1,000 samples of raw and ready-to-eat, non-soy, plant-based meat alternatives for the presence of various bacterial pathogens and indicators. Almost all of the samples tested were found to be satisfactory. There were elevated levels of generic E. coli in 3 samples, and the appropriate follow-up activities were taken. There were also several plant-based dairy plants that sampled refrigerated plant-based beverages, plant-based ice cream, and plant-based cheese for microbial hazards. The survey results had very high compliance with a 99% satisfaction rate. So overall, our survey results indicate that plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy sold in Canada are generally safe for consumption. However, as with all food, good hygienic practices are recommended for producers, retailers, and consumers. Next slide, please. I've included for reference the assessment criteria used on the plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy samples. The samples were assessed using criteria based on the principles of Health Canada's standards and guidelines for microbiological safety of food, the policy on Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat foods was also used, as well as the Food and Drug Act and other guidelines developed by international food safety authorities. There hasn't actually been assessment guidelines or criteria established in Canada, specifically for the presence of E. coli 0157, Salmonella, S. aureus, or indicator organisms in plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy at this time. So Salmonella, E. coli 0157, Listeria, since they're considered pathogenic to humans, their presence was assessed as unsatisfactory as it is considered a violation of the Food and Drug Act, Section 401. And you can go to the next slide. So this is a snapshot of another past targeted survey, but on the chemistry side, analyzing undeclared allergens and gluten in a variety of plant-based meat products. Of the 290 samples tested in this survey, almost 96% did not contain any detectable levels of allergens or gluten, while there were 12 samples containing varying levels of undeclared gluten, milk, egg, peanut, sesame, or soy. And there were 4 plant-based alternatives to meat products deemed to represent a health risk and were recalled from the marketplace. So in Canada, food allergens and gluten must be declared in the list of ingredients if they are present in order to comply with the requirements of the Food and Drug Regulation sections. And Health Canada considers that gluten-free foods prepared under good manufacturing practices, which contains levels of gluten not exceeding 20 parts per million due to cross-contamination, meet the intent of the Food and Drug Regulations, Section B24018, for a gluten-free claim. Next slide, please. Okay, preventive control inspections. This is another major risk control measure CFIA uses. So preventive control inspections are evaluations of a regulated party's preventive controls to assess compliance with regulatory requirements. The frequency of inspection is based on the risk the commodity contributes to human health, as well as the establishment's overall risk profile, their mitigation measures, and past compliance history. Inspection activities for plant-based meat and dairy focus on assessing industry's controls for allergens and microbiological hazards. Next slide, please. So overview of past issues CFIA has identified related to plant-based alternatives to meat and dairy products. So the CFIA follows up on consumer and trade complaints related to all foods, including plant-based meat and dairy alternatives. Between 2016 and 2024, the most common complaints associated with plant-based alternatives were related to non-compliant labeling, harmful physical materials, which would include things such as glass, metal, and wood, and undeclared allergens. When the CFIA conducts food safety investigations, they look to identify the deviation or root cause of the problem. Common deviations for the complaints included lack of mandatory labeling, inaccurate ingredient lists, and inappropriate use of rework. During the same time period, there were approximately 67 recalls conducted in Canada, the majority due to undeclared allergens. However, there were also a few recalls associated with microbiological and physical hazards, with the most recent recall associated with listeria in plant-based beverages, plant-based alternatives to milk. There have not been any outbreaks associated with plant-based alternatives to meat. However, there was a recent outbreak of listeria infections linked to the recalled plant-based beverages in July 2024. The presence of Listeria monocytogenes was confirmed in the facility, and the affected lines were immediately shut down. The investigation was not able to confirm the primary source of the contamination within the establishment, which is not uncommon with the investigations regarding pasteurized products like plant-based beverages. However, cross-contamination could have occurred after processing. The Canadian company that processed the plant-based milk linked to the outbreak has permanently closed all 4 of its plants. Apart from this outbreak, there were 2 other foodborne illness outbreak cases associated with salmonella in cashew cheese. The source confirmed was raw cashews, which were soaked at room temperature, providing ideal growth conditions for the bacteria. Now I will turn it over to my colleague, who will go into detail about Canadian labeling requirements and examples of compliant and non-compliant labeling.
Thanks, Andrea. I will be presenting an overview of Canadian regulations related to labeling. Most prepackaged foods sold in Canada are required to be labeled with certain mandatory information. A common name includes names in boldface type in the Food and Drug Regulations and Safe Food for Canadians regulations. These are standardized foods. They have compositional standards of identity and names that must be used on the product label. For foods that do not have compositional standards with mandatory common names, it is the name by which a food is generally known, and these are considered unstandardized foods. Date markings are things such as durable life dates. So, for example, best before dates or packaged on dates. Other date markings include expiration dates that are prescribed for specific foods only, such as infant formula. Storage instructions need to be declared if they differ from room temperature. Examples could include statements such as keep refrigerated, keep frozen, refrigerate after opening, or store in a cool, dry place. All prepackaged foods must declare the company name and principal place of business of the responsible party. Imported products may declare either the name and principal place of business of the foreign manufacturer, or the Canadian importer may be identified on the label. If a Canadian dealer name and address is declared on the label of an imported food, it must be accompanied by a qualifying statement, either imported by or imported for, or a country of origin statement is required, such as product of Jamaica. These statements must be grouped with the name and address of the Canadian importer. This is to prevent a consumer from being misled into thinking the products are Canadian origin. A list of ingredients is required for all prepackaged products that contain more than one ingredient. All ingredients, including components, which are ingredients of ingredients, must be declared unless they are specifically exempt by the regulations. Ingredients must be declared in descending order by weight, so the ingredient present in the greatest amount is declared first. It is not acceptable to substitute any ingredients which are not declared on the label. If a manufacturer knows that they may, on occasion, alternate between the use of two ingredients, both must be declared in the list of ingredients, and there are specific rules on how this must be done. Food allergens, gluten, and added sulfites must be declared. I will go into more detail on the specific allergen labeling requirements in a coming slide. A net quantity declaration needs to be on the label in metric units, by weight for solids, by volume for liquids, or by count for certain foods. A nutrition facts table is required on most prepackaged foods. These tables are designed to convey information about the nutrient content of food in a standardized format, which allows for comparison of foods at the time of sale. Clear, uniform information supports consumers in making informed food choices towards healthy eating goals. All of the information required to be declared on the label must be clearly and prominently displayed and readily discernible to the purchaser under normal conditions of sale and use, and must be declared in both Canadian official languages, English and French. It is acceptable to have information in additional languages on a label, provided that the required information is declared in English and French. All information and representations on food labels in any language must be truthful and not misleading. In addition, there may be commodity-specific requirements that must be met. Plant-based foods that meet the compositional standard for simulated meat products need to declare the common name simulated and naming the meat or poultry being simulated, plus a statement that the product does not contain any meat. For example, simulated chicken burger contains no poultry. The purpose of this qualifying statement is to prevent a consumer from being misled into thinking the product contains meat. The CFIA has an industry labeling tool that provides detailed guidance on Canadian labeling requirements for food products. This tool is used internally by food inspectors as well as by the food industry. Next slide, please. There are a variety of claims that can be made on the label of plant-based alternatives to dairy and meat products if they meet the required compositional criteria. Canadian regulations do not currently define the terms vegetarian or vegan. The term vegetarian is commonly used on food labels to communicate the food does not contain ingredients from meat, fish, or poultry, but may contain dairy or eggs. The term vegan is commonly used to communicate that the food does not contain any animal-derived product, including dairy products or eggs. It is recognized that several different approaches to a vegan lifestyle exist. Beyond following a diet that is plant-based, vegan may have additional meanings, such as the food never being tested on animals, labor standards and conditions, or use of genetic engineering. Additionally, most vegans do not consume honey, but some might. There are other claims such as plant-based or veggie that may be used if the required criteria are met. The CFIA guidance document on simulated meat and poultry products describes how and when these claims may be used. As with all labeling information, any claim or representation on the food label must be truthful and not misleading. Next slide, please. Allergen labeling regulations are one part of the food labeling rules in Canada. Food allergens, gluten sources, and added sulfites are required to be labeled in the list of ingredients using plain language or in a contain statement that appears at the end of the list of ingredients. We will show an example of how this looks in the next slide. Like all labeling statements, precautionary labeling must be truthful and not misleading. Products with a precautionary statement that say may contain and then list all the priority allergens would not be considered in compliance unless there is a real risk of all of those allergens being present in the food. There are 10 priority allergens in Canada: peanuts, tree nuts, sesame seeds, wheat, eggs, milk, soybeans, fish, shellfish, and mustard. These are subject to the allergen labeling requirements we are discussing, in addition to sources of sulfites and gluten. It is important to remember that this list represents the foods causing the most frequent and most serious allergic reactions in Canada. However, a consumer can be allergic to any food, which is why an accurate list of ingredients is essential, and substitution of ingredients, whether or not they are a priority allergen, is not permitted unless they are declared. The main points to keep in mind for precautionary labeling are that it is a warning statement on the label that informs consumers with food allergies or sensitivities about the possibility that the food may be cross-contaminated with a food allergen or a source of gluten or sulfites. Precautionary statements are not a substitute for good manufacturing practices, including thorough cleaning of tools and equipment or proper scheduling of production of foods that contain allergens. Precautionary labeling should only be used when, despite all reasonable measures, the inadvertent presence of allergens in food is unavoidable. Health Canada and CFIA have recommended the wording may contain for precautionary statements. Other wording is also permitted, but must be truthful and clear. Precautionary labeling must not be used when an allergen or allergen-containing ingredient is deliberately added to the food. If any allergens, gluten, or sulfites are included in the product formulation, they must be declared as ingredients or components in plain language or identified in a contain statement at the end of the list of ingredients. Allergen labeling is considered mandatory information and therefore must be declared in both English and French. If allergen labeling is missing in one of the Canadian official languages, this could present a risk to allergic individuals that may result in a product recall. Next slide, please. There have been many food recalls in Canada, including some for plant-based foods, due to undeclared or misdeclared allergens in the list of ingredients. Recalls have occurred because of the incorrect declaration of sodium caseinate in the list of ingredients. Sodium caseinate is a milk protein It must be declared by its common name, sodium caseinate, in the list of ingredients, and it must be clearly identified as a source of milk in plain language. This is done by declaring milk in brackets immediately following the declaration of sodium caseinate in the list of ingredients, or by declaring milk in a contain statement that immediately follows the list of ingredients with no intervening material. This information is required in both English and French. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of a plant-based rice beverage that was recalled in Canada for undeclared milk. The list of ingredients declared was non-dairy cream. When the CFIA conducted a food safety investigation with the Canadian importer, the foreign manufacturer confirmed the ingredient added was sodium caseinate. It must be declared in the list of ingredients by its common name. To comply with Canada's allergen labeling rules, the ingredient sodium caseinate must be followed in brackets by the plain language term milk. Or there must be a contain statement immediately following the list of ingredients that states contains milk in both English and French. Next slide, please. Here is another example of a plant-based pudding that was recalled in Canada for undeclared milk. In this example, sodium caseinate is declared in the list of ingredients, but is missing the plain language allergen declaration. This helps milk allergic consumers to identify that there is a milk-containing ingredient in the product. So what would be required is milk in brackets in the list of ingredients after sodium caseinate, or contains milk at the end of the list of ingredients. Next slide, please. Here is another example of a product recalled in Canada. This was a soy drink powder that declared non-dairy creamer, which was later confirmed to be sodium caseinate, which is a milk derivative. The ingredient is not declared by its proper common name, and milk was not included in the food allergen source information. The contain statement only soy. Next slide, please. This is an example of a compliant list of ingredients for a food product containing sodium caseinate. The list of ingredients for this coffee creamer, which declares sodium caseinate and is followed in brackets by a milk derivative. The label also has a contains milk allergy statement. Both are not required. One or the other can be declared to comply with Canadian allergen labeling regulations, but it's certainly acceptable to declare both. Next slide, please. Finally, here is a reference list of industry guidance that is available on the CFIA website. We have provided links to more specific labeling guidance for simulated meat and poultry products. We have a link to guidance on preventive controls for allergens, gluten, and sulfites, which describe measures a food business can take to manage allergens within their operation. There is an industry labeling tool that provides detailed guidance on Canadian labeling requirements for food products. As well, you can find a toolkit for food businesses, which provides more information on our regulations, licensing, inspection, and other information. To help food businesses understand the key elements of our regulations, we have developed fact sheets that are available in 12 languages, including Spanish. Finally, we have included the link to the Canadian policy on Listeria monocytogenes and ready-to-eat foods that was updated in 2023. Next slide, please. This brings us to the end of our presentation. We are happy to respond to questions related to plant-based foods. If we are unable to answer the question immediately, so if we need to consult with other subject matter experts in CFIA, we do commit to getting a written response back to the group. Marie-Pierre and the moderators, I'll turn it back to you for the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, Andrea, and Gloria, for this very good information. So as you indicated, Gloria, we can take some questions. We have some time. For participants, you can either put them in the chat function at the bottom of your screen, or also you can raise your virtual hand. But do not hesitate. And again, like sometimes those topics take a while to digest and assimilate. So if you think about a question after, just follow up with us, and we would be happy to follow up with the complete answer. Right now, I don't see anything. And we will.
I was going to say, Marie-Pierre, just to add to the conversation in the chats, because there's a lot of interest between the two languages, English and Spanish. We do have a YouTube channel at ICA that we've posted in the chat. And so it takes a couple hours. So probably by tomorrow, normally we should be able to post on YouTube the two sessions. It's also available if you're less familiar with YouTube. Some of you will go to our ICA Canada webpage in Costa Rica, and you can go to the country page. We have all our videos from all the previous webinars with CFIA as well. The presentation, the deck was in Spanish, but there's also an English version. Those are things that CFIAs will be happy to share with you. Maybe, I don't know what's the best way, Marie-Pierre, do we have that email or contact information in the chat?
I don't know if you have, or is it simpler to send it to you, Jean-Charles, and you should it to the people. So we'll send you both. I think you already have the Spanish, but we'll send you the English as well.
Okay.
So it can be sent to every registered participant for sure.
Sounds good. Yep. So for those of you who are less familiar with ICA, our head for the event planning and Zoom webinars and all the logistics is Ana Paulina Sanchez. So she'll be the one coordinating the presentation, the YouTube channel, the decks, and all that. Any technical questions on the content that you've heard? And congratulations to the speakers. I like the flow. I thought it was, it makes every life easier for the interpreters, that's for sure. But I thought it was very insightful and clarifying for those mostly outside Canada or less familiar, and potentially many from the industry who are also getting a refresher here. So we can leave it open for a minute or two. If we don't see any more questions, Marie-Pierre, I'm happy to close the session as well.
Sure, and maybe I will just take an opportunity though to reiterate that we will put a link in the oh, and I still we have a question. I'll just finish my idea. So we will put a link for a survey, a CFI survey. We like to know what we did good and where we can improve. So please take a minute. But we do have the questions in the chat right now. Maybe I can read them for the presenters. So good question. First question is there a regulator-guided limit for milk-based beverages to be classed as lactose-free? So is there someone, Gloria, Andrea, or Michael, who wants to take a shot at this one? And we can also follow up totally on that one if it's outside of today's.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit outside just because we're talking about a milk-based beverage as opposed to a dairy-free beverage. I'm not too sure on that one, but we'd be happy to consult and get back.
Sounds good. Thank you, Andrea. Next question is from Brazil. So I am a director from a plant-based vegan food factory, and we are in the middle of negotiation, and probably we are going to export to Montreal. I'd like to know if it's mandatory to make microorganism tests before sending the product. And how does the case of the plant-based milk contaminated with listeria affect the inspection?
I guess there's a couple parts to that question. I can take a stab at part. So there's no mandatory test per se prescripted for sending these products to Canada. However, Canadian importers need to ensure that the products that they're importing are safe to consume and meet Canadian requirements. So imported foods need to be prepared with the same level of food safety controls as what would be produced here. So it's really the onus is on the importer to ensure that the appropriate hazards are identified and controls are in place, but there is no specific mandatory micro testing before sending a product. But that's something I guess to discuss with the importer in Montreal. They may have their specifications that you would need to adhere to so that they meet the overall spirit of the regulations, which are outcome based. The second part, I'm not sure if one of the others want to take a crack, or I can take a crack and you can add to it if you'd like. So yeah, the current, the most recent outbreak obviously was quite a devastating issue that affected a lot of people, and it's I guess quite a reminder to everyone how vigilant we need to be to ensure that things like listeria are adequately controlled. So as far as how that could affect the inspections, that's something still being looked at. So our current oversight is as it is, and we are looking at that particular case to see if more needs to be done. So
thank you, Michael. I don't know if there's anything to add, but we have 2 more questions in the chat. Maybe we can go to these ones. So I'm not sure if it was mentioned, but are there any processing companies in Canada focusing on plant-based dairy products? And are there any challenges that they are currently facing?
Certainly, there are definitely processing companies in Canada that produce plant-based dairy alternatives. For sure, there are a number of them. I'm not sure if I can speak to the second part of the question, though, any challenges that they're currently facing.
And there's another question which I see more as a comment, but I'll read it for the participants anyway. So with regards to why a person who does not like animal products, as meat and milk, wants to have limitation forms of them, I think it's more handy and healthy to consume vegetable as they are plain and also cheaper. And I think it's a general observation. And I think the interest of the presentation also like we have today, and that's a little bit why we have proposed it when we start with AICA and we have developed the module, because it is an increasing trend to see some plant-based alternatives to meat and dairies in some markets. And I realize in maybe in some countries of Latin America and across the AICA member countries, it may not be yet that active, if I can say, but in other parts of the world we are dealing with, it is very actively developing. So that's a little bit like why we thought CFIA can share this information in our approach, because we're seeing an increasing trend even in Canada, and we operate increasing. And there's another question in the chat about the presentation. So the decks will be shared in English and Spanish, so you'll receive them absolutely for future reference as well. And you are most welcome also to just have a look also on CFIA website. Like there's a ton of information out there that you will see referred to also in the presentation. So have a look, and again, any question you have as a follow-up, please do not hesitate to contact us through your colleagues at AICA or directly to CFIA.
So a reminder for those of you where CFIA has its own survey If you look in the chat, Shannon Kelly has posted the link to their survey. The ICA one isn't in the chat. It'll appear in Zoom. As soon as we close the session, you'll have this new window where you can use about a minute and a half just to fill in some 1 to 5 questions in terms of your assessment and evaluation of today's webinar. And I don't see any more, just appreciation for the webinar today. I think that's it. My thanks to everyone then. Sincere thanks to CFIA and to the speakers. Job well done. Our thanks to the interpreters in Costa Rica. Our thanks to the team here, putting it all together in terms of logistics and planning, agenda, brochures. And we're looking forward to future webinars with CFIA. Stay posted, stay tuned. If you want to join our mailing list, make sure to write to the ICA Canada office. We're happy to add you to the newsletter where we talk about upcoming events. And there's so many topics around there on food safety and trade that there's tremendous interest in Canada's leadership in this space too, in the Americas. So it's a delight to work with CFIA. And all the best to you. Stay safe, everyone. Unless Marie-Pierre has anything else to add, we're all good from our end here.
Just to echo your thanks, Jean-Charles, it's always a pleasure to work with you. We're always also interested in knowing the interest in terms of technical information like that we can share. So if there's any suggestions for future workshops, we are always happy to hear your feedback. And again, thank you. Thanks to the team at ICA Canada, the interpreters, and the presenters. And I wish you all a very good day.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.